Okay. And making sure, do y'all still see the full screen of the slideshow?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today we're covering history, which, as you can imagine, there is a lot. So, this even does not encompass everything. It was hard to figure out, what to put in, but got the major stuff and things to really give an idea of what has taken place, because there's a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding of what happened on October 7th as being, they make the propaganda makes it sound as if like, oh, that was the beginning of everything, and Hamas just attacked completely out of nowhere. So it's really important to understand some of the history behind that. Uh, the picture here at the beginning is Syed al-Hashim Mosque. It was Archaeologists think that it was built around the 12th century, and it was damaged in an Israeli airstrike after October 7th, but just recently was reopened. Well, that was a few months ago. Hopefully, it's still open. News updates. Um, Shoot, I didn't write any notes here, but I think the biggest thing is that President Trump announced who is on his board for the peace plan. Um, and it's people like Jared Kushner, and Marco Rubio and other people who you can imagine have motives and interests other than the well-being of the Palestinian people or actual true justice and peace in the area. But the UN has like given their blessing, and that's moving forward. And the rains and the cold continue in the Gaza Strip, so that's you know causing a lot of um, suffering with the displaced people, Palestinians who are there. Um, Now, the Ottoman Empire, uh, this was also called the Turkish Empire. And as you can see on the map, it covered a really wide area of the Middle East, West Asia, including Palestine. And they were in power for, you know, hundreds of years until after World War One. Um, this we touched on last week, but again, the early European Jewish colonizers started coming in to Palestine much earlier than World War II. So again, that's another common misconception that they didn't start moving there until after World War II, and that was the reason why they went to Palestine. But the first Aliyah, or big movement of Jews to Palestine, happened in the late 1800s. And Aliyah means ascent or going up in Hebrew. The first wave was European Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe. They came and were establishing their own farms and kibbutz, which are like their own Jewish villages and communities, where they were developing kind of their own economic systems. Um, Before their arrival, there were indigenous Jewish populations, primarily in like Jerusalem and Hebron. Between 1882 and 1903, about 25,000 European Jews immigrated to Palestine. So that about doubled the number of Jews who were in Palestine at that time. The second Aliyah, between 1904 through World War I, was primarily Russian Jews, and they established 24 colonies, and it was about another 40,000 immigrants. And at this time, a lot of those were strong Zionist believers, whereas the first Aliyah, they were going looking for more economic and like cultural freedom and not such a strong commitment to the Zionist project. But the second Aliyah was more of that, and they were looking to conquer the land. 1914 to 1918, so this was during World War I. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the German side, and the Arab Revolt started in 1916 with they wanted freedom from the Ottoman Empire and wanted to establish their own Arab state or states in that large area that was the empire. However, during the war, the British pushed their way into the area, and the Ottoman Empire fell to the British. And so then Palestine was taken over and occupied by the British. The Balfour Declaration, this was a major kind of turning point because the British gave their sort of official blessing on the Zionist project. This declaration took the form of a short letter from Lord Arthur James Balfour. He was the British Foreign Secretary, and he wrote it to the head of Britain's Jewish community, a Lord Rothschild. And it was approved by the British cabinet and basically said that they were going to establish a home for Jews in the land of Palestine and that Britain would help in facilitating that, both in helping them immigrate and financially to get the immigrants settled there. Um, and this also helped develop the Britain mandate over Palestine that came in after World War I, and was part of the newly created League of Nations. They set more what they considered, advanced countries over countries that had been defeated in the war, which is this. So the mandate for Palestine gave Britain control over the land. The 1919 Paris Peace Conference established the League of Nations, and in creating this mandate, they only recognized Jews as having a relationship to the land of Palestine, and only their rights would be recognized. Now, 42 to 47, so this, encompasses the period of World War II. Um, the and due to the Jewish Holocaust, there became more agreement on Zionism among European Jews, because whereas prior to that, there had been a lot of strong opposition in the Jewish community throughout Europe and Russia. There was a lot of disagreement about Zionism and a lot of um, Jewish people who were against setting up a state in Palestine. But in 1942, the Zionists held a conference at the Biltmore Hotel in New York, and they called for turning all of Palestine into a Jewish state. So we see how even from that very beginning, they were looking at not just pieces of Palestine, but the whole area. However, the General Assembly of the UN passed a resolution in 1947 that was called the Plan of Partition to divide Palestine between Jews and a smaller Arab state. And that's what you see here on this map, where they were outlining all of the blue area for the new Jewish state and leaving the orange area for the indigenous Palestinians. In 1948, this is another big year. Probably like if you're going to remember some of the points um, and some of the main dates in the history, 1948 is a big one. So at this time, the British who had been occupying Palestine since the end of World War I, they withdraw due to the Jewish immigrants then saying that they were going to establish their own state. And basically, they sort of named themselves a state, the People's Council representatives of the Jewish community in May 1948. So that's the date that's recognized as the establishment of the state of Israel. And even like to this day, that date would May 15th, 1948, is celebrated in Israel as sort of their Independence Day or the founding of the state of Israel. The declaration of their new state did not include any recognition of the partition plan, but it claimed ownership over all of Palestine, that which they called Eretz Israel, which means the land of Israel, and with no designated boundaries. And they claimed the right to the land only for Jews, but not only Jews who were already living there, but Jews throughout the world. It was now theirs. So, with the establishment of the state, for the Palestinian people began what's called the Nakba, which means catastrophe. And this displaced over 700,000 of the indigenous Palestinians. And to this day, those displaced people and their descendants have still not been given the right of return to their homeland. Um, After partition, it was estimated that the population of the new state of Israel was about 42% Arab. But to the new Jewish state, the Israeli state, this was seen as completely unacceptable. So they wanted to um, ethnically cleanse the land and get rid of as many Arabs as they could. The their plan for ethnic cleansing was called Plan Dalet, and they would make sporadic attacks and organized operations that were designed to take as much territory as possible. And they really also tried to do this before the British completely left so that they still had that military support there. Um, they also, carried out not just displacing people, but some massacres. Um, so after the establishment of the State of Israel, war broke out, Arab-Israeli war, but the Arab armies were defeated in from October 48. So remember again, the state was established in May. So October 48 to early 49, over 400 villages and towns were destroyed and depopulated, and about 13,000 people were killed. The new state of Israel now controlled about 77% of the land area that had been um, land under the Mandate Palestine. And it had been depopulated of about 90% of its indigenous Arab population. And so you can see here on the maps, in 1947, this was the UN proposed partition plan. And then after 1948, this was how much the state of Israel occupied, which you can see led to what there still is today in the Gaza Strip and the general area of the West Bank. But of course, now the area that is actually lived in by Palestinians is just tiny little islands of communities throughout that area. Um, and because of all of this displacement, neighboring countries who were also recently independent, because they also had been part of the Ottoman Empire, all of a sudden, well, they're establishing who they are and establishing their own government. They're receiving all of these refugees. And so it really destabilized the whole region. Um, okay. Yeah, and a comment in the chat. This is just so soon after World War II that it's wild that ethnic cleansing would be the undisputed direction. Yeah, because you would think, right, after World War II, um, that people would not be so accepting of that. Um, but they had really, I guess, laid the groundwork for that even before World War II with developing the Zionist ideology. And sorry, I got my windows mixed up here. Go over here. Hold on. Oh, yeah. Now it just completely disappeared. Hold on. Stop share. Okay. The next major turning point was 1967. Um, This was when Israel attacked the Arab armies again. Um, President LBJ, he urged the Israeli president to avoid hostilities, but at the same time provided them weaponry and basically, in you know, between the lines, gave the okay that it would be all right for Israel to attack Egypt. So the Israeli military was already, by this time, because of US support and support from like Germany and Britain, their military was largely superior to the surrounding nations. So, in a surprise attack, they launched a war against the Arab states surrounding them. They conquered the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Egypt's Sinai, and Syria's Golan Heights. The remainder of the lands of historic Palestine now at this time came under Israeli occupation. Israel also annexed East Jerusalem, which until this point, Jerusalem had been kind of shared between Israel and the Palestinians. But now, even East Jerusalem was under Israeli power and is part of the Israeli state. With some, even to this day, there are some Palestinians who live there in East Jerusalem who have Israeli citizenship, but not equal rights. They also began to establish Jewish settlements in the Golan Heights in Syria. And so that's something we continue to hear about today, even in the past year when Israel has carried out operations in Syria. Um, a lot of it, you'll hear about the Golan Heights and also other areas where they're continue to encroach further and further onto Syrian land. And in 1967, this was another major point of expelling a huge amount of Palestinians, estimated about 475,000. In 1982, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed. Well, sorry, they were formed in 62. By the late 1970s, a lot of their fighters were stationed in Lebanon, particularly in Beirut and southern Lebanon. They would sometimes from there carry out attacks in Israel. And so in 82, Israel wanted to defeat the PLO and expel them from Lebanon. The US gave them 1.4 billion in military aid in 81 and 82, and this allowed Israel to carry out this military operation. The war continued until the PLO did eventually leave Lebanon, was forced to leave. According to the Lebanese police, conservative estimates of casualties, including Lebanese, Palestinians, and Syrian, from just June 4th to August 31st, were about 19,000 killed and 30,000 wounded, with most of the dead, about 80%, being civilian. The Israeli military, their own count of casualties from the 5th of June to October 10th, so even this is a longer time frame, they had 368 deaths and a little over 2,000 wounded. So this is a trend that you'll continue to see just the disproportionate amount of deaths and injuries on the Palestinian side. Um, and of course, that's not to say like that either side, like their lives are more valuable than the other, but just the disproportionality is just undeniable. Israel's ally in Lebanon, Bashir Gemayel, was elected president of Lebanon, and then he was assassinated. The Lebanese Forces militia blamed the Palestinians for this and then murdered more than 3,000 Palestinian refugees in the Shatila and Sabra massacres. And Israeli soldiers who were still in the area surrounded the camps to prevent them from being able to leave. So they supported this massacre if they did not, directly take action in it. And here I have a short video about the first Intifada. And oh, come on.
If we're meant to have audio, I don't. Does it have audio?
The last 10 seconds just kind of like say, but the struggle continued. Um, if you were there at the screening we had of Nyla and the Uprising, you know a bit more about the Intifada. And it's interesting that that video says they were armed with stones. That is true that there was some stone throwing, but it was largely peaceful protests. Okay. Now, Hamas was just formed in 1987. It was initially sort of a social organization where they set up clinics and schools, and they were even initially undercover supported by Israel to undermine the PLO. The Hamas does not support the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, which were completed in 95, which you saw in the video where Bill Clinton is um, standing behind Arafat, who was representing Palestine, and Rabin, the prime minister of Israel at the time. You know, they're shaking hands, agreeing to this agreement um, that was done in 95. Hamas and a lot of the Palestinians do not support it because it doesn't have any recognition of Palestine, but rather Arafat and the Palestinian um, kind of self-designated leaders. They weren't really leaders of the people and of those who led the Intifada. They agreed to recognize the state of Israel. So it was really a um, kind of a step back for Palestine and giving a lot. Um, I can't think of the right word for it, but um, saying that they would recognize Israel while Israel was not recognizing Palestine and any rights of Palestinian people. So it was a greatly imbalanced agreement. The West Bank at this point is divided up. Lots of checkpoints are placed everywhere. The wall and electric fences. You can see in the picture how the area was divided up. So, Area A was under Palestinian control. Area B says joint Israeli and Arab Palestinian control. Um, but you can make a informed assumption about who really controlled the area. And then Area C, the majority of it was under Israeli control. And that paved the way so that now in post October 7th, there are just like, I want to say thousands of checkpoints in that little area um, that just control where Palestinians can move, where they can go throughout that area. The Palestinian Authority was established after the Oslo Accords, and well, it has the name Palestinian Authority so that it sounds like it's something established by the Palestinian people. It was really developed by the US and Israel to protect Israeli settlers and their interests. Violence accompanied the Oslo process almost from its start. An Israeli settler carried out a massacre at a mosque. Then Hamas responded by carrying out its first suicide bombing inside Israeli territory. On November 4th, 1995, an Israeli Jew assassinated Prime Minister Rabin, um, and that partly having to do with also the Oslo Accords and how these extreme, um, like far right uh, Israeli Zionists weren't happy with the Oslo Accord. And so Shimon I don't know how to say his last name, um, of the Labor Party, he assumed the position of prime minister, but only for a short time, as in June 96, he was replaced by the Likud party's Benjamin Netanyahu, who we're all familiar with now. That was his first time as prime minister, because later he was out of office and then he returned. Uh, so the second intifada took place around 2000, 2005. And in contrast to the first intifada, this was had a lot of violence. This is when Hamas carried out a lot of suicide bombings, including ones that went into um, Israeli areas and attacked civilians. And this was really a setback for the Palestinian movement because then internationally, Israel was really able to promote this idea that they're victims of these violent Arabs. Um, and their Israel used live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators. Then they turned to heavy weaponry, and it was just more and more violence going on during that time. Hamas was actually elected in 2007 as the governmental body over the Gaza Strip. But this led to Israel putting in a blockade to prevent people from being able to go in and out of Gaza without special permission. They restricted everything that came into the Gaza Strip and including any goods, food, building materials, everything. And that was the start of this blockade that has continued to this day. And then in from like 2008 through 2014, you saw just one violent operation after another of Israel attacking Gaza. Operation Cast Lead started with bombs being dropped and then a ground invasion. Human rights organization documented the Israeli Defense Forces using white phosphorus and targeting a hospital, a school, and residential areas. About 1,500 Palestinians were killed, 65% civilians, and 14 Israelis killed, as reported by Israel. Um, so once again, that great disproportionality. Operation Pillar of Defense was an 8-day assault on the Gaza Strip. It started with the assassination of a Hamas commander, with their stated aim being deterrence. But it stopped quickly due to a ceasefire arranged by the Egyptian president, Mohamed Morsi. In that 8-day period, 165 Palestinians were killed and 6 Israelis were killed. Protective Edge was a very um, was an increase in even more violence and destruction, even compared to what had happened in Pillar of Defense and Cast Lead. It started with three Israeli settlers being kidnapped, and Israel accused Hamas of responsibility. And so they carried out arrest campaigns throughout the West Bank. And Hamas retaliated with rocket fire from Gaza, which was met with Israeli airstrikes and artillery strikes. It was reported that the Palestinian death toll was over 2,000, of which about 1,500 were civilians. The scale of damage to infrastructure, schools, and hospitals in residential areas was unprecedented. 71 Israelis were killed, of which 66 were soldiers. So 2015 to 2023, in 2016, under the Obama administration, the US made an agreement with Israel for a military aid package worth 38 billion that would be divided up over 10 years. So about 3.8 billion a year. And this, so this was in 2016. It's due to expire this year, but it's going to be, um, you know, it's going to be renewed, and there's talk about, even increasing it. Um, in 2018, Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, um, which was a major thing because, again, Jerusalem is, an important site to not just religious Jews, but also Christians and Muslims. And so this was, in a way, saying that they recognized Jerusalem as like the capital of Israel. And Trump also eliminated all UNRWA funding. In March 2018, through the end of 2019, Gazans began weekly marches to call for um, their rights and to get rid of the boundaries that were basically that were trapping them in the Gaza Strip, so that they didn't have freedom of movement, basically kept in this open air prison. The people in these protests, again, it was similar to the first Intifada. It was largely peaceful, um, some stone throwing, which is obviously no competition to guns and all sorts of weapons. And the Israeli response by the IDF was shooting with live ammunition and a lot of people being maimed because they would specifically target people's legs. In 2019, US aid was cut um, to the West Bank and Gaza. Now, 2023 to now, I think you're familiar with what happened on October 7th, 2023. This is when Hamas and other Palestinian fighters attacked Israel. 1,175 Israelis were killed and around 250 were taken prisoner. And that gave Israel reason to declare war, or they um, use that as justification, right? And that's when this rhetoric of them being victims and Palestinians and Arabs just hated them. And so they had to respond with in self-defense, all of that propaganda really ramped up. Um, but as we looked at in a previous week, this turned into just a full-scale genocide in the Gaza Strip. It also opened the doors to increased violence and oppression of Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And since October 7th, I mean, what had been left of actually Palestinian owned and settled villages in the West Bank have just been shrinking as settlers take over that land. Um, a lot of settlers have increased in violence, and so attacking Palestinian farmers and yeah, and even from the Israeli government, they have had talks of, we're going to develop this many more homes in the West Bank area. And so they're just taking more and more of that land. And now, since 2023, there have been, uh, there was a ceasefire in January of 2025, which was quickly dissolved um, after Israel broke the agreement, but blamed it on Hamas. And then the ceasefire that was implemented in October, which supposedly is still going on, um, but there have been documented over 1,000 violations of the ceasefire that Israel has done, um, including, more violent attacks, not letting in, you know, nearly as much food aid as they had agreed to, just a small percentage of it. And, but um, Netanyahu and President Trump have continued to push this idea that it is in place and Israel's recognizing it and following it. And so now they're going into the second phase and President Trump's peace plan, which he is leading. So let me, so that brings us today. Let's stop the share and the recording.